Okay, I think we will start, and I would actually like Bohdan to begin with some musical interlude to begin with, and then we will start with our program. Yes.
Okay, so this is a very historical instrument. I thought I'll start off with the piece which depicts the southern Ukrainian lands in the 14th, 15th century. It's supposed to paint an image of your head of the so-called Dikke Pole, the wild steppes. And this is a place where you could say the modern Ukrainian state was born. The prelude to this piece goes as follows. It was written by Ignat Khodkevich. It's called The Slave Market of Kapha, Невільничий ринок of Kapha. The sun arises above the Black Sea. The imam clatters a minaret and calls everyone to prayer. Suddenly the market awakens and all of the slaves are being brought into the market. And they're singing their songs of their homeland, which they miss. But these songs of homeland are quickly brought down silenced by the sounds of the chains. And the whole day the market goes in this mix of sounds of Orient meets the Occident until the very end when only one song is only heard, and it is a Ukrainian melody.
Thank you, Bohdan Schutka, for this beautiful musical interlude, and thank you all for coming. And I want to start off by saying awareness is what everything is all about these days. Being aware of the world we live in and the times we live in, being aware of countries, of people, cultures, history, politics, seas, nations, conflicts, and wars. Awareness also means being aware of ourselves and being aware of our privileges. And we have many privileges we oftentimes are not aware of. And I would like to point out one privilege in particular today, and that is that we are here in Vienna today. Because just a mere 2,000 kilometers eastwards in eastern Ukraine, people are under attack. And they have been for years. They have been tortured, they have been deported, killed, deprived of basic human rights, lived in fear. And amongst these people are also children. So today is about awareness and about war. Hence the title of our event, aWAReness. And on behalf of the organizing team, it is my pleasure and my honor to be welcoming all of you here on site and online. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you. As a small disclaimer right away, as you see, there are pictures and videos being taken. If you do not wish to be on them or have questions or, well, a problem with that, feel free to approach us, and we, of course, will accommodate that. I would like to give you some context on how this event actually came about, because, as we all know, on February 24th, 2022, when Russia started its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the international community was, well, shocked, even though the eastern parts of Ukraine had been under attack for years already. But still, people were stunned and actually at a loss of words. There were feelings of fear, anger, sadness, defiance, shock. And what followed afterwards was a wave of solidarity across the globe. Words of support, pictures, images, postings, artworks, music, hashtag we stand with Ukraine, hashtag support Ukraine. And we do support Ukraine, we truly do. And this is why members of the Alpbach community back in March said, this is important. It's important to express your support with words, but we want to do more. And so in March, it was the members of the Forum Alpbach network, the European Forum Alpbach, and members of TUMA, an Austrian organization for Ukrainian youth in Austria, that joined forces to come up with, well, something. The idea was to come up with an event that educates people about what's happening in Ukraine, that sheds a light on things from a Ukrainian perspective, not necessarily from a Western or Austrian perspective, so to speak. But there was also the goal of celebrating Ukrainian culture and Ukraine as such for what it is, namely a sovereign nation with its own culture, history, and beauty. And this is how today came about. We are well aware of the fact, though, that it is not possible to do Ukraine and its culture and history justice within the scope of just one event. So today is actually the kickoff of an entire event series that will be leading up to the European Forum Alpbach. And this event series will be taking place in the next couple weeks and months. We have already set 2 dates. They will be smaller events focusing on topics in depth, and today will actually serve as a basis for that, the knowledge we will have and learn today. And then at the European Forum Alpbach, the goal is to use the knowledge we have gathered throughout these events and today, and go even further, go deeper, try to do more, know more, learn more. This is actually also why it's my pleasure to tell you that we have an artist from Kiev who has joined us online today, Alevtina. She is graphic recording. You can see it here on screen, and I hope it works online as well. She will be sketching what we're saying in the first part and also what the speakers will be telling us. So thank you, Alevtina, for joining us, and it's nice to see your hands. But before we go any deeper with the program, actually, I would like to give the microphone to Serhii, the current General Secretary of the European Forum Alpbach, without whom and which it would not have been possible to organize and host this event here today at the Impact Hub Vienna. And I would say the floor is yours already. Thank you, Serhii.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jenny. And let me say thank you to all of you who made this evening possible. As you already mentioned, I think we had a massive wave of solidarity, and we heard a lot of saying we stand with Ukraine. But my experience was that there was also a big lack of knowledge about Ukraine. And so I think evenings like this and events like this are very important, even more important now, to give more insight what's happening in the moment in Ukraine, but also about the context of culture, media, and what was the third? It was history. Thank you. To get more insight on Ukraine, and that's why I'm convinced that evenings like this are very important. As the European Forum Alpbach, at the end of February, we decided to change our plans and to focus on what's happening now in Europe. And because we are convinced on the 24th of February, the situation in Europe changed completely. We face a new Europe already, and that's why the general theme of the European Forum Alpbach this year will be the new Europe. And we will discuss exactly about that, about the massive impacts of what happened on the 24th of February in Ukraine, in Europe, in the world, and about the consequences on our society, on economy, on a lot of things. And these will be the perspectives we will take on at the Forum Alpbach in August. But this event shows also a very important thing the European Forum Alpbach can provide, a huge network. We have about 30 alumni network clubs and IGs, groups all over Europe and also in the world, where alumni who take part in the European Forum in the last 20 years are engaged in their home countries. And I think an event like this, and we had also an online event already only some days after the 24th of February, which involved people from the Ukraine, from Kiev, telling us how the situation now actually is. And this shows how important this network is and how strong and impactful this network can be. So let me say thank you again for organizing this event and for your engagement in the clubs. I wish all of us a very exciting evening. I have to say that I have to leave early because it's our wedding anniversary today, and you can imagine, all of you who are married can imagine that it's a quite important day. So that's why I have to leave early, but I hope I can still at least stay for a little bit. Yeah? So I wish you all of us a very exciting and insightful evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Serhii. I was also asked to express the gratitude and the contentment of TUMA, the aforementioned organization. TUMA is a very active organization, has been for over 12 years, and they're working for intercultural cooperation, exchanges with regard to Ukraine all the time. They host all types of events, one of the biggest ones being the Ukrainian Ball in Vienna every year. And the entrance fees you paid for coming here will be donated to TUMA, who will then be using that money to provide humanitarian aid and medicine for people in Ukraine. People online, by the way, can also donate, and please do. If you just Google TUMA Austria, you will find a donation button right away, and it would be great if you also donated from afar. Maybe add that it was due to the event aWAReness, so that we have some idea where it's coming from. And this is actually what today in general is all about, right? It's about educating people, it's about learning more, it's about intercultural exchange, and about showing support, about donations. I will give you a little overview if you don't already know about the structure of today's event. There will basically be two parts. The first part will be hybrid, meaning online and on-site, and there will be input provided by our three speakers on the topics of history, media, and culture. Our three speakers are Serhii Plokhii, Lidiia Akryshora, and Stefan Schocher, who will be joining us from afar. After that, we will hear some more beautiful Bandura music by Bogdan, and then the online part will conclude already, and the on-site people will have the opportunity to enjoy some Ukrainian artworks and artists, as well as Ukrainian food, by the way, and afterwards we'll be moving on to an on-site part called a World Cafe, which will be an interactive format. After that, we will go to a bar to just conclude the night together. And later on, Ola, Moni, and Mary will be taking over for the World Cafe from IG Kiev, Club Alpbach Lower Austria, and Upper Austria for some more context. And last but not least, before we really delve into it, I would just like to point out that we have numerous artists here who are exhibiting their artworks outside. You can buy some artworks if you want. We have photography from the Ivan, help me out, Honchach Museum from Kiev, which is wonderful. Just have a look at that as well. Bogdan will be selling his CDs, and please do buy this beautiful music. And the Ukrainian restaurant will also be providing food. As I said, you can only pay in cash, but know that this money will also be used for a good cause, in this case for the city of Kharkiv, for a children's hospital in Ukraine, and for the artists themselves to support them with their Ukrainian creations as well. And now, without further ado, it is my honor and pleasure to announce our very first speaker today, who is none other than Sergio Bloghi. He has come all the way here to Vienna, so thank you so much for joining us today. He's a Mikhailo Sanchuszewski Professor of Ukrainian History at Harvard University, and his research focuses on Ukraine, its relations to Russia, the former Soviet Union, and the history of war in Eastern Europe. And this is exactly what he will be talking about today, contextualize the war in Ukraine right now and give us some more insights. So Serhii, if I may ask you to join me here. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for this invitation, and thank you for the introduction. As I was listening to Bogdan's wonderful playing, I was also thinking about the parallels between the story that music was about captivity, and then the song, in particular the Ukrainian song, emerging out of the sound of the chains. And I was thinking also about the defenders of Mariupol, the Azov. In Ukrainian folk tradition, there is also a popular song about the three Azov brothers who escaped the Turkish captivity. So it's really, sometimes people are saying that history doesn't repeat itself, but certainly history rhymes. And this is one of those cases where the history rhymes really, really very, very loudly. When the aggression of Russia happened and started in the early mornings of February 24th of this year, really few people could predict what would happen. Few people really thought that a war of aggression of that scope was possible. And one of the reasons for that disbelief was the actual casus belli, the reason for waging that war. And the explanation that was provided at that time was, the key explanation that was aimed at Europe, in particular, was that it is about NATO, that it is about the expansion of NATO, and that Russia was there to defend itself. But when the time for negotiations came, the offer that was made was really the offer that there would be no negotiation whatsoever. That was the December of 2021. So no one was interested to talk with NATO about anything. And then later, when Finland and Sweden decided to join NATO, what we heard from Moscow was that actually it doesn't matter. It's not important. And those were one of the very few words of truth that we heard in the last few months really coming from Kremlin, because that war is not about NATO, and it was not about NATO from the very start and from the very beginning, but it was very much about history. Where else you would see the leader of a country, of aggressor, would spend in days and weeks putting together a historical essay. And then in the de facto declaration of the war on Ukraine, dedicating half of the time discussing the history and claiming that Ukraine is an artificial creation that was allegedly put together by the Bolsheviks, and in particular Vladimir Lenin. And this history is about, and this misinterpretation, this abuse of history that we certainly heard and continue to hear from Mr. Putin, is about one thing and one thing only. This is about denying the right of Ukraine to have its own history, and that means denying the right to have a future. The argument is there that Ukraine didn't have its own history, and that is the argument that is really false on a number of levels. And again, the song that we heard here, the song about the importance of Ukraine's and difficulty also of Ukraine relations with the Black Sea area, the Ukrainian presence there, the history of the Cossacks. This is one of the key elements in the history of Ukraine that really puts Ukraine apart from Russia. Because if the phenomenon of the Cossackdom as such is a common phenomenon for Russian and Ukrainian history, in Russia you can see Don Cossacks and Amur Cossacks and so on and so forth. The biggest difference is that the Cossacks of Ukraine were able to create a state of their own back in the 17th and 18th century. They were able to create a culture of their own, or reclaim the culture that was there and shape it in a new way, to fund and build buildings which are known today as Cossack Baroque, and also build cultural and educational institutions. In the year 1659, when the Cossacks decided to cut their ties to Moscow and conclude an agreement with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, one of the key elements or the key conditions in the agreement that they signed with the Polish king was that the college that existed in Kiev at that time, and it became known as Kievan-Mohila College, that college was supposed to be recognized as an academy and given the status of academy. So this is a very interesting and very telling in its own right phenomenon about the sort of a culture, the sort of institutions, the sort of a state that the Cossacks of Ukraine were able to create in the 17th and 18th century. And of course, that Cossack state was crushed by the Russian Empire in the 18th century. So much for common history. Out of that really destruction of the Cossackdom and Cossack state came a very important part of Ukrainian historical mythology, the historical foundation in terms of the narrative of the modern nation of Ukraine that was formed and created in the 19th and 20th century. And the Ukrainian anthem starts with the words, "Ukraine has not died yet," or "Ukraine is not dead yet," or in the new interpretation that the glory of Ukraine is not dead yet. But one way or another, whatever interpretation you take, it goes back to the history of the destruction of the Cossack state. And the argument that is being put there is that, yes, the state is gone, the state doesn't exist, but we are alive. And that means that Ukraine is alive as well. And that goes, again, that understanding of what the nation is. goes directly against the interpretation of the, what nation is or supposed to be, promoted by Vladimir Putin and Russia. Because in his history book, only the imperial nations, the nations that had states before that, have the right to exist. And he is following really in the footsteps of the long tradition of imperial Russian thinking and imperial Russian doing. Because if, when I was reading his article and then listening to his speech, what came to my mind first and foremost was the year 1863, and in particular the Valuyev Circular, where the Minister of Interior of the Russian Empire, not Minister of Education, not Minister of Culture, there was no Minister of Culture, but not Minister of Education, but Minister of Interior, deciding on whether the Ukrainian language should exist or should not exist. And that circular, it prohibits the use of the Ukrainian language, and then there would be new documents for a long period of 40 years. So Ukraine survived the 18th century, Ukraine survived the prohibitions of its language and culture in the 19th century, and there were 5 attempts, in the course of the 20th century to declare independence of Ukraine. So it was the 5th one that in 1991 that eventually succeeded, that the Ukrainian state actually existed more than in the course of a few months or even shorter than that. And it is that strive for independence. And with independence, Ukrainians mean independence. They don't mean dependence. So that strive for independence that is being actually not just challenged now, but the attempt is being made to destroy it with the help of the arms. Why is this happening? There is a number of reasons for that, but one is that what we witness today is really the probably one of the last battles, very bloody one, but one of the last battles of the empire that existed on the map of Europe, existed on the map of Eurasia, of the world, for a long period of time, and the name of that empire is the Russian Empire. It started its disintegration like Austria-Hungary, like the Ottoman Empire, in the midst of World War I. It was put together by the Bolsheviks, and then the fate of the empires, and the fate of the empires in the 20th, 21st century is the disintegration, the destruction. It caught up with it after the fall of the Soviet Union. Ukraine played extremely important part in the disintegration of the Soviet Union. In December of 1991, when the Ukrainians voted for independence, there were more than 92% of those who took part in the referendum voted that way. After that, the Soviet Union fell apart within 1 week. The question can be why? Because the answer, the question that Ukrainians were answering in December of 1999 and 91 was not whether you want the Soviet Union to continue. The question that they were answering was whether you want Ukraine to be independent. They said yes. And after that, with that vote, they decided actually the fate of Russia, they decided the fate of Kazakhstan, they decided the fate of the majority of the republics of the former Soviet Union. The reason why Ukraine, there was no referendum on independence anywhere else in the post-Soviet space. Ukraine was the only one, and that referendum said yes, and the Soviet Union fell apart. Because Ukraine was the second largest Soviet republic at that time in terms of economic potential, in terms of the population. And Russia of Yeltsin and Gorbachev, who was the head of the Soviet Union, the president, the first and the last president of the Soviet Union, didn't think that it made any sense to continue with the Union project without the second largest partner. Yeltsin explained to Bush that Russia would be outvoted and outnumbered by Muslim republics. That was at least one of the explanations of why Yeltsin was not fighting for the Soviet Union once Ukraine left. What that means for today is that any attempts at rebuilding and reconstructing Russian control over the post-Soviet space is actually doomed to fail without Ukraine. It is for that reason that the war is being waged there, and Ukrainians are trying to preclude the formation or reformation, another form, again, not exactly the same form, not the Russian Empire, not the Soviet Union, but another form of the Russian dominance of that post-Soviet space, with, of course, the threat that would be going to Eastern Europe, to Central Europe, so a replay in many ways of the situation of the Cold War, except that today we are in a more dangerous place than during the Cold War, because we are having the most fierce war in Europe since the end of World War II, in terms of the number of people involved, in terms of the casualties, in terms of the kind of equipment that is being used there, in terms of the refugees, up to 7 million who left Ukraine for Eastern and Central Europe. Good part of them are returning now, but altogether up to 14 million of refugees and displaced people in Ukraine alone. We didn't see anything on that scale since the end of World War II. And one more thing that maybe would ring really very familiar, or sound very familiar here, because apart from the imperial collapse, there is also a story of reconstructing, rebuilding of the utopia of the big Russian nation. Because when Putin says that Russians and Ukrainians one and the same people, what he has in mind, of course, is that Ukrainians are not, he doesn't mean that Russians are Ukrainians, he means that Ukrainians are Russians. And this is really an attempt to build the so-called Greater Russia. The annexation of the Crimea in 2014 was compared by some of the very good Russian scholars to Anschluss of 1938. So this story of building Greater Germany, Greater Russia, is really familiar to Europe, is familiar to European audience, and we also know where it leads, we also know where it ends. And in conclusion, I would want to say that Ukrainians built, after the fall of the Soviet Union, one of the very few free societies on the post-Soviet space, a democratic society. And Ukrainians strongly believe that they're fighting today not just for Ukraine, that they're fighting also for a set of values which they closely associate with Europe. So in that sense, they deeply believe that they are also fighting for Europe. And I have no doubt that actually this belief is not just based on the solid foundations. I think that this belief is true in very many ways. Because the conflict between, or the war, the all-out war between Russia and Ukraine, there are many levels and layers to it. And imperial collapse is one of them, and attempts to recreate the imperial nation, Greater Russia, is another one. But there is also a dimension of this war where we see a very autocratic, authoritarian state trying to destroy one of the very few democratic states and polities in the post-Soviet space. Because Ukraine's real threat to Russia has not been moving closer to Europe, has not been potential membership in the NATO. No one was really offering it before February 2022. But the threat was in the attraction of the ideas of democracy, or potential attraction of the ideas of democracy in Russia. And from that point of view, out of the outcome of this war really depends a lot of things in terms of the future of Europe and future of the democracy in Eastern Europe, in Central Europe in particular. So there is a lot of stake there. And I and other Ukrainians were really very surprised and in a very positive way, and are very grateful for the support that Ukraine and defenders of Ukraine and Europe are getting in Europe itself and in Austria in particular. So I want to thank everyone present here for that as well. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so. Hello? Is it working now? Yes? Yes, there we go. Thank you so much, Serhii, for these insights and this short overview of the history. During the World Cafe, we will get the chance to delve a little deeper, even more, unfortunately, just for our on-site participants. The online participants just have to remember all of this and go to our other events and the European Forum Alpbach. Breath. Now, we just go right over to our next speaker, who is sitting right in front of me, the lovely Lydia Akrishora, who does so many things that it's difficult to actually summarize. She's a freelance journalist. She's worked in communication for years. She's active as a board member of TUMA, and she really works. Her goal is to foster cultural diplomacy, intercultural exchange, and social activism, actually. She currently works in a Ukrainian program at the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna, and today she will be talking about Ukrainian culture, about the Ukrainian diaspora specifically, how Ukrainian culture has actually changed since 2014, since the Maidan movement, and she will also show the influence of the Ukrainian diaspora on other cultures. So, Lydia, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here tonight, and I'm very grateful for your presence. When writing this speech, my first thought was to talk about my experience as Ukrainian expatriate in Austria. I'm deeply attached to my home country, despite living abroad, but very open to the world. That is why I'm very happy to tell you why and to talk about Ukrainian culture tonight. I was born in Western Ukraine, have lived 6 years in Kyiv, then moved to Vienna, where I have been living for the past 8 years. My roots are in a small Carpathian town situated in the region of Chernivtsi, around 70 kilometers from Romanian border. Its name is hardly known in Ukraine, let alone abroad. And yet it has a lot to be proud of. It is the birthplace of composer and performer of the folk song Червона Рута Nazary Yaremchuk. Together with the founder Levko Dudkivsky, Vasil Zinkevich, and others, he played in the band Smerichka there. Known as the Ukrainian Beatles in the 1970s, they popularized Ukrainian folk rhythm and sound through their popular stage performance. The Soviet culture establishment shunned them as too provincial and atavistic. But as just with the Beatles, their fans knew better. But let's back to Vienna. Recently, at the end of May, Ukrainian translator and writer Lidiia Akryshora declaimed some of her poems in Viennese Roteba at Volkstheater. She was describing the Donbass as a garden blossoming with ripe apricots. I don't know if that is an accurate description of what is an industrial basin, but this is how it is remembered by its inhabitants and Akryshora herself. Everyone also seems to remember that no apricot tree grow where Russian border is. I remember the Wachau Valley last summer, with locals and tourists dining at Heuriger's among the hills and valleys, amidst the blossoming apricot trees. Had I realized before the 24th of February that Donbass looks much like Wachau? Lidiia Akryshora also reflected on how words gained a new meaning since the invasion began. I share that impression with many Ukrainians and with many foreigners who stand by our side. Take the beautiful and hopeful word light, for instance. It ceased to mean the same as before. Light can expose you, you see. Darkness must reign over cities and villages to protect them from rockets and artillery. Likewise, corridor is no longer the place where guests are welcome first at your home and where you wait for them to get out while your bidding farewells takes longer than expected. Now a corridor in Ukrainian is something else altogether. Yes, the meaning of words has dramatically changed. This will be the only two small examples of how for Ukraine culture goes always along with national identity. How culture and symbols are the compass which helped us to keep our course as a nation. Let me tell you about also the Ukrainian embroidery sheet, Vyshivanka. I'm wearing one actually right now, which was presented by my grandmother. The tradition of Ukrainian embroidery goes far in the past. Each region of the 24 regions of Ukraine has its own pattern. For example, in Western Ukraine, and especially in the Carpathian region, patterns are dominated by large and colorful flowers. Red roses are also typical for the Donetsk region, where the hottest fights are now taking place. Luhansk, in turn, displays red and blue. White on white, on the other hand, comes from the north region of Poltava. The Crimean Tatars, ethnic people of annexed Crimea, which suffered under the deportation of Stalin after the Second World War, have a unique old ornament called ornyek. It depicts a lot of flowers and greens. Vyshivanka and embroidered clothes are tightly woven with Ukraine's survival. During Holodomor times, Stalin hunger in 32-33, there was a way of saving lives. People from the hardest hit regions could exchange their vyshivankas for wheat. During happier times, it identifies the region of those who wear it. There is even an interesting fact well known among embroiders, that people tend to instinctively choose patterns from their region. Famous Ukrainian writer of the 20th century, Boris Antonenko Davidovich, was a promoter of Ukrainian culture, and as such was arrested on Stalin's order. On his first trial, he asked his wife to bring an embroidered shirt. "Bring me vyshivanka. Let them see that a Ukrainian is being judged." A sad but brave phrase symbolizing the fight for symbol, language, and identity. Another bright example is actually very close to Austrian history. Archduke Wilhelm von Habsburg was an officer of the Imperial and Royal Army, an informal Habsburg candidate for the throne of a planned Ukrainian satellite state during the First World War. His life was marked by the struggle for Ukraine's independence from the Soviet Union. He was arrested and died in Soviet prison in 1948. For his love and devotion, Ukrainians gifted him vyshivanka, that he liked to wear under his uniform. Wilhelm went into a history as Vasil Vyshivany. Vyshivanki, however, were not always that popular. The Russian imperialism and later Soviets looked down upon all things Ukrainian. Everything has changed in 2014 after the Euromaidan revolution. For a lot of Ukrainians, this was a point of no return. Symbols played an important role again. Vyshivanki started being seen. People were looking for signifiers of their national identity and culture. In Vienna, they were also seen during bicycle races along the ring. Summer celebrations were held near St. Barbara Church, where Austrian and Ukrainian films were screened, musicians performed music, foreigners and Ukrainians could exchange and learn about each other. The church was gifted by Maria Theresia in 1775 to the Greek Catholic Church. More on the Ukrainian part of Vienna history can now be discovered online in newly created archive Interactive Ukrainian Vienna under euv.gwait. The Ukrainian Ball, held in Vienna and organized by TUMA since 2015, established a beautiful tradition of cooperation with Ukrainian designers. Its debutants sport Ukrainian patterns embroidered upon their dresses. After the Maidan also, embroidered patterns were also resought and modernized by local designers. Different styles are often used now on casual outfits. The Maidan Revolution saw a revival of other symbols. Famous Ukrainian authors from the early to mid-19th century, which bored us in school, became trendy and fashionable overnight. Such figures as poet and feminist Lesya Ukrainka, painter and writer Taras Shevchenko, not to be confused with the famous football player Andriy Shevchenko, or philosopher and writer Ivan Franko, made their appearance on helmets and protest signs. Let's hit this rock, as Ivan Franko famously said, and the quote received a completely different meanings that year of 2014. Franko also defended his PhD in philosophy at the University of Vienna and was famously fond of the Prater Park. He was the regular patron of Café Central, where he often met Viktor Adler, the founder of Austrian Social Democratic Workers' Party. The latter, a true friend and admirer, called Franko the most prominent poet of his time. Franko was the first to wear a vyshyvanka in business casual, with his jacket. Vyshyvanki, as I said, spotted floral motifs. Two special flowers in particular symbolize Ukraine: sunflowers and red viburnum. There is a recent story of a babushka who gave sunflower seeds to a Russian footman, telling him, I quote, "Take it. At least beautiful sunflowers will grow up on your body after you get killed." Sunflowers not only symbolize the sun, they also grow on the never-ending Ukrainian steppes. Red viburnum, small red berries, is famous in Ukraine for healing cough in winter. The popular Cossack song, "Oh, the red viburnum in the meadow," comes from 1914. In a song, the bushes of viburnum are situated along the road, awaiting and greeting soldiers safely back to their homes after the fight for Ukraine. The song was revived in 2022, after the lead singer of Boombox Band performed it on the desolated Sofiyska Square in the Kyiv city center on the third day of war. The fight for memory continues. Vyshyvanki elements during the ball are changed into vyshyvanki worn under the uniform at the front. Ukrainians hope, however, to welcome everyone with red viburnum on the next Ukrainian ball. Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia, for this truly beautiful input and insights on Ukrainian history and your beautifully made top by your grandmother, your babushka, if I'm right? Babushka. Thank you so much. Our last speaker will be joining us online, actually, but I'll introduce him real quick. He unfortunately couldn't be here today with us in person. His name is Stefan Schocher. He's an independent journalist and media correspondent in Germany, Luxembourg, and in Switzerland. And in Austria, he's worked for Die Woche, Der Standard, and Datum. He has written and published about Ukraine, about Moldova, the Middle East, and Central Asia. And during the Maidan Revolution, actually, in 2014, he lived and worked mostly in Kyiv and reported from there about what was happening and about the so-called referendum in Donetsk, and later also about the front in eastern Ukraine. Tonight he will share his insights about the Russian war in Ukraine and also about the role the media plays in this regard. And now I am crossing my fingers that the connection works and we can listen and see him. Oh, there he is. Hello. Hi, Stefan. Can you hear us, me? We cannot hear you.
Well.
There we go. Can you again say something, please?
I can hear you very well.
Perfect.
If you can hear me, I can just start.
We can hear you, and, well, the metaphorical floor is yours.
Super, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor, and I'm very sorry that I'm not able to join you directly there due to circumstances that lie in the pandemic. I've been working with Ukraine since 2003. My personal understanding of journalism in general is you have to understand moods, you have to know history to understand interpretation, and especially political use of history. And as a matter of fact, journalistic coverage and coverage of a country or a conflict or a situation as such always has to take into account common knowledge of the audience it is meant for. It is impossible to do journalistic work without summing up things or simplifying to some extent. Otherwise, we would be writing encyclopedias every day or administrating archives. Journalistic work is communication with a certain audience. If I'm speaking to you here, for example, I guess I had to guess beforehand what you would like to know or what you would be interested in, so I do not bore you to death. When a reporter speaks about the conflict in Northern Ireland that affects the policy of a British Prime Minister, we may have to no detailed understanding of the current state of the Northern Ireland conflict and the paragraphs of the Good Friday Agreement, but at least we most probably have a rough idea as such. It was not so about Ukraine for far too long. For a Western audience, Ukraine started to exist only in the year 2004. For the coverage, this meant starting from zero, and literally from zero. But starting from zero in a conflict situations means that there is the need to explain a lot in a very, very short time, and this is simply impossible. So Ukraine, in the eyes of a Western European audience, started its appearance on the front pages of international media as a quirky country, with politicians with funny hairdo, politicians who got mysteriously poisoned, beheaded journalists, Kongatse, revolutions. Back then, it was just one revolution. There was no expertise in Ukraine. And if so, on a journalistic side, it was mostly based in Moscow. When I had been freelancing in Ukraine later in 2007, 2008, I was told by head offices in Germany, Luxembourg, and Switzerland that Kiev is being covered from Moscow, and therefore they did not need any pitches from Kiev. I think this does not explain it all, because one can do proper coverage from Moscow without falling into Russian narratives, but it is not up to the correspondents to decide which story is being published in the end. This decision is being made in the newsrooms. And in the minds of the media managers, Ukraine was, and to some extent, unfortunately still is, part of the Russian world. And so it was, and to some extent, unfortunately still is, for the audience. But there also had been a learning process. The revolution 2013 and the following years kind of opened a window where some media managers realized that covering Ukraine from Moscow does simply not work. When the war in the east of Ukraine started in 2014, there was a broad interest with all the problems that came along. How to call the Russian-supported militias in the east of Ukraine, for example. Are they rebels? Are they terrorists? As Ukraine used to call them, are they separatists? None of that actually explains it. But what happened for sure was that there was an incredible increase in quality of coverage, contradicting existing stereotypes mentioned before. Funny hairdo, revolutions, and so on. But still, friends in Kiev were joking often, when I come to Kiev, the roof must be on fire. From a journalistic point of view, there was one massive issue. It is terribly difficult to cover such a comparatively low, intense, but long-lasting war, which since 2014, with keeping an interest alive and extract game-changing events when an information war is going on at the very same time. The daily artillery fights in Ukraine over years had been news in Ukraine, of course, but they did not have relevance for a reader in Austria or Germany, for understandable reasons. All the various angles had been written about, another reportage from the front line, another gloomy report from about people living there, another portrait of a traumatized soldier, but how to produce relevant news and fighting is the daily routine. I have no answer to how to cover such a long-lasting war for an audience that is used to short news on social media, breaking news, and sensations, and that has a very visible tendency to accept unnormal things as normal in no time. All I can say is, as a journalist, one has to identify game-changing events, explain the relevance of that event, and maybe add background where this development originates, so that a story can actually go deeper than the breaking news content. The conflict about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was exactly such an event that provided a perfect opportunity to actually go into the historic dimension of this conflict and draw a bigger picture. It was a rare event. At the very same time, it was hard to sell this story to editors who actually make the decisions what is being published and what is not. What they have in mind is circulation numbers, clicks, and figures. And it is easy reading short news and sensations that generates traffic on news sites. Actually, news sites nowadays make their traffic rather with gossip about royals than actual news. And as a consequence, expertise is barely a factor sometimes. I was told once by an editor-in-chief who I did not have the pleasure to work with, quote, "Well, as for me, there was too much coverage of Ukraine in recent years." This was 2018, by the way. But okay, Ukraine is Schocher's hobby. I'm sure if I would have been dealing mainly with Great Britain, the US or Russia, it would not have been considered a hobby. It would have been considered an expertise. And this does reflect to some extent an attitude in the audience. Arguments about this war very often come along with a conglomerate of facts that are reassembled completely out of their context, mixed with lies and naivety. One example, Gandhi and the myth about non-violent resistance. Gandhi acted in a completely different political environment, and how possibly could a non-violent resistance work against an army that is willed to shoot anyone? It would just be suicidal. Or that arms delivery fuel the war and not defending or not fighting would not trigger Russian attacks. Have people forgotten about Crimea and the Donbass or Srebrenica? If you follow the discussion about the war now in Austria, Germany, or wherever in old Western Europe, there seems to be a very vague understanding about political mechanisms, about what a state is and how a state works, how diplomacy works, and what it can achieve and what it cannot achieve, and how war works. How else can open letters be by so-called intellectuals like Alice Schwarzer or Franz Obel be explained? Franz Obel wrote, quote, "Perhaps Ukraine would disappear from the maps in the short term, but what happens now? How many seeds of future conflicts are sown?" If someone writes a line like that and even feels like publishing it, he yells out into the world that he has no idea about history, about the seeds of future, in this case, current conflicts that have already been sown during centuries. He screams to the world that he has no idea about politics and about political mechanisms. All he says is, please do not bother me any longer with all that noise, and if ethnic cleansing is the price, then okay, let it happen. And this is a tendency that throughout the debate and also in the media coverage, reducing this country to a bargain chip between Russia and the West, without the right to have its own will and not taking into consideration the Ukrainians. Bucha, Irpin, Hostomel were places where horrific war crimes had been committed. But when explaining Ukraine's resistance to so-called intellectuals who feel the need to raise their voice because they feel disturbed in their comfort zone by reality, they should maybe take a look at Kherson and Crimea. Because there it is, where an occupational regime is forming or has been formed, that is nothing but a terror regime of infiltration, random abductions, and torture, deportation, reduction, re-education programs, resettlement, and camps. And all this as a policy. What is happening there is ethnic cleansing at last. There are good reasons that the occupants are turning off internet and to not let too much information out of these territories. And there are good reasons that Russia is not also apparently setting up filtration camps on the border of Estonia to not let people out who could possibly pass information. And all this matches publications in RIA Novosti, which had been writing about the Endlösung basically, and the extinction of Ukraine. Matches statements by Russian officials and the Russian Orthodox pattern. Ukraine's resistance is a resistance against extinction, nothing less and nothing more. And what Russia is doing there is genocidal, let's face it. In dealing with Russia, Western Europe is pretty slow in learning. Maybe the truth is too hard to swallow. Maybe the déjà vu from the first half of the 20th century is too painful. Maybe this belief is a refuge. But if something smells like poo, tastes like poo, looks like poo, it makes sense to realize that it is most likely is poo. But I am not sure Western decision makers have realized what they are dealing with when it comes to Russia. How else can it be explained that Macron insisted recently that there has to be a solution without humiliating Putin? Sebastian Kurz, as an elder statesman, recently saying all wars have been ended by negotiations. Hitler was not defeated on the negotiation table. I'm asking all those who see a solution in diplomacy to please come forward with precise ideas how such an agreement could possibly look like, and especially formulated. Is it genocide light? But nevertheless, there is a learning in dealing with Russia. Europe has been taking steps, by the way, that Ukraine has been taking a long time ago, and sometimes had been criticized for it, banning Russian media, for example. But the learning process about Ukraine itself is a much slower one, and there are indeed difficult points to explain Ukraine from a journalistic point of view. The language law, for instance, the Azov battalion and its Wolfsanger, Bandura as a national hero, and nationalism as such, that there is a difference between ethnically motivated nationalism and indicative and inclusive nationalism without any ethnic component, for instance. These are topics that do not make it easy to explain Ukraine to a Western audience. They touch very sensitive chapters of our own history. Ukraine is anything but a perfect country in terms of institutions and political system, political culture, and also political debate, as well as having a critical view on its own history. Let's not idealize, but Ukraine is in the making, and it is a country that provides freedoms for its citizens, and that is only right now fighting for its very independence that it has been since 1991. And let's also not make the mistake to mix up the political system and the political elite on one side and the urge of the population of Ukraine to create and not obey on the other side. A willingness the population of this country has shown in 2 revolutions and the war that started in 2014 and that escalated now. A civil society that is active, vibrant, and loud. There is a public debate. And yes, Ukraine is chaotic. Its biggest problem is its political elite. But the reason that this country still works, despite its political elite, it's its population and its unwillingness to obey. And this leads back to the Western audience. They appear to be a deeper misunderstanding of what totalitarianism actually is. For many, it seems to be something vague, something from the past, something that in the mindset of many, as it seems, cannot come along with mobile phones, casuals, sporty-style, free market, fast food, and poshy cars, but it does. That unfortunately also means, to some extent, cell phones, free market, unlimited consumption, fast food, and modern cars are what freedom is to many in Western Europe. When stores were closed in the pandemic, people started to feel uneasy and started to protest. A big part of Western European public does not have an understanding anymore of what freedom means, because they do not have the slightest idea what it means not to be free. They do not know the opposite. They do not know what totalitarianism means. There is no understanding what it means to live in a country like Belarus or Russia, to live under observation of the state and having no personal rights, existing at the mercy of authorities, like in the occupied territories in Ukraine. Even more, they often see themselves living in exactly such a system, but at the same time refuse political participation. Tens of thousands protested in Vienna comparing public health measures with totalitarianism, and this was just a month. And in this sense, Ukraine should be and can be a reminder for societies in Western Europe what the value of freedom actually is. I hope I did not bore you. Thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you a very nice evening, and I'm a bit sorry that I cannot join you at the bar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefan, for your insights and your perspectives. It's so important to go beyond headlines and really try to raise this awareness, which is also one of the points of this event, to really go further and also to explore Ukrainian culture some more. Bogdan will now be playing 2 pieces on his Bandura, and then we will move on to the break. And again, thank you so much, Stefan, for at least remotely connecting. I hope we can go to a bar another time.
Quite an oriental touch to it, and a lot of this comes from the early music, where there was this portrayal of the eternal battle between the peasantry, the people who were every year raided by the Tatars, which eventually became allies of Ukraine to this day. So next piece is another one of these kind of oriental pieces. It's called Echo of the Steppes, and it has a kind of a Vienna connection, because the original modernist avant-garde school of Bandura was founded in the starting 1904, you can say, when Nathodkevich collected the last of the Bandura players for a conference, and he brought them up to so this was in Kharkiv back then, and the Russian noble elite woman would invite every year for an archaeological conference. This was the second one they had, and they invited a local academic, Nathodkevich, and asked him to make a little presentation. And he brought in a group of 7 barefoot, dirty, smelly, blind musicians playing an instrument called Bandura, which was a bit different back then. But they were outraged. They were so outraged that they even left him out of the program. But these 7 men were the last 7 actively playing musicians. As Mr. Plokhii mentioned, even the performance of Ukrainian language was forbidden, which meant that something like a Bandura was in decline. This revival led to the fact that around 1920, there was over 900 Bandura groups throughout Ukraine, also in Bratislava, in Czech Republic, even in Moscow and Kuban. Some of them went out to the West, like Vasil Yemets, who was for a long time a professor of music in Czechoslovakia back then, in Prague, and he eventually made a career in Hollywood and actually died in the 80s. Very successful man. He was known as a Bandura. We talked about the Vyshyvanka earlier and how it was modern to show the Vyshyvanka underneath your blazer. Well, Vasil Yemets took it next level. He already had the Vyshyvanka, so he wore a frock over his Vyshyvanka. So it kind of shows the evolution. So the next piece is by Grigory Kitasti, which was a Bandura player from southern Poltava region, which is where the steppes begin. And he ended up also in Vienna right after World War II. They were kidnapped by the Nazis to play music for the Ostarbeiter in order to lift up morale in the ammunition plants and so on. And I think, when I play this, I think it's quite almost difficult to play it all the time because people really like it. But I think of the fact that what he must have felt and what we are now confronted with, having to, realizing that we might never see our home again. And even though we believe in our victory, but it is still a thought in our head that we cannot go home tomorrow. One of the reasons I moved to Vienna from New York was that I always wanted to able to be going back home. And from here, I can be home in 4.5 hours, but now it's not a possibility. So he wrote this while in the Austrian German lands, and reminds me of, it's very, actually, it was for him like homesickness, I suppose. So it's called Echo of the Steppes. One thing, I suppose Bandura is a bit of a different instrument compared to other ones because Bandura always involves a history lesson with it. Otherwise, it makes maybe not complete sense. It doesn't paint the full image. But the instrument behind me, the one I played earlier on, it's a so-called Kharkiv Bandura, and this is actually the product of this conference I told you about. So 6 of these 7 blind men who played the Bandura came from the Kharkiv region, and they held their instruments differently. Chodkiewicz, being a classically trained violinist, he took his left hand and he applied it with the technique onto the dashboard. Now, one of them was from the Chernihiv region. During the Stalinist purges, actually all of them were eradicated for the most part. These 17 men, there's a wonderful film, actually. I really suggest everyone watch it. It's called The Brave Chorobra 17, Ukrainian. I think I have to remember what it's called in English. It's also in English. It's about this group who ended up in Detroit. But it tells his story. And one of the reasons this instrument survived was because of the immigration. Because in the post-war Soviet Ukraine, actually in 1944, the Soviet authorities realized they need also something to pick up the morale of the Ukrainian nation, which suffered enormous losses, and they decided to, but they already destroyed the old Bandura, so what do? You have to create a new Bandura. So they took the one part Chodkiewicz left out, which was the Chernihiv school, and they built a wonderful factory in Chernihiv, which was mass-produced instruments like a Chinese factory nowadays, which meant there was a lot of instruments. People spent hours perfecting them and so on, in comparison to the Kharkiv Bandura, which doesn't have an automated mechanism for the half tones. But in the long term, actually, the diaspora enjoyed these instruments more because they were more stable. This instrument's not as stable. But another thing, back to before I play my last piece, the diaspora. Fun fact: Lydia mentioned this group from in Czerwona Ruta and Smerichka, and these were really revolutionary back then. And one of the reasons one of them, Ivan Ivasuk, was killed was because I think his song was #1 in the Soviet charts in all of the republics. Well, a fun fact about only such a genre as Ukrainian Canadian music is that there was more Ukrainian music being recorded in Canada in the 70s than there was in all of Ukraine. And the next piece I'll play is an invention of my teacher from Toronto, which I would label as Ukrainian Canadian festival music. But, yeah. Ukrainian Rhapsody, it's called. Thank you. I can play some more in the back then if they want during the food. I can play some more. I would gladly. I have repertoire for 3 hours. So.
Okay. Thank you so much. Bohdan, thank you. Thank you for showing the variety of the bandura as well, the different types and also the different melodies and emotions it can convey. Truly beautiful, and thank you for playing some more. Again, he has brought some CDs with him, which he uses to maintain these beautiful traditional instruments, so please do go ahead and buy them. And as mentioned, we now already have to say goodbye to our online audience. Thank you for joining us online. Please do check out our social media and websites for the parts of the event series so that you can still stick with us there. And for our on-site audience, there will be now a break. Outside there will be food called vareniki. I hope I didn't mispronounce it, and drinks, also artworks by the artists as mentioned, and we will rearrange the room for the second part, which will be the interactive World Cafe. So thank you and enjoy your break.